Thank you, Mr Temporary Speaker. In my electorate of Maitland, an Aboriginal single mother of 4 young children that I'll call Jane had her tenancy terminated after her casual boyfriend did several small marijuana deals from her premises over a period of 2 weeks. Jane was not involved in the drug deals, was not charged and cooperated with police to such an extent that they sent a letter of support for her to the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal. The tribunal reluctantly terminated Jane's tenancy because it thought it had no discretion to do otherwise, following a 2013 New South Wales District Court decision in New South Wales Land and Housing Corporation v Kane. The New South Wales Court of Appeal would eventually overturn that decision, affirming the tribunal's discretion to decline termination. But in the meantime, Jane's case was decided. Many people from both sides of politics regarded that decision as an injustice. Indeed, it was Abraham Maslow, a psychologist, who first articulated the need for shelter as the most basic human need in his hierarchy of needs. Because before we start to motivate ourselves to work towards realising our full human potential or self-actualisation, we must fulfil the most basic level of need for shelter. Shelter, of course, refers in modern-day terms to housing, or as we call it within this government now, social housing. We must be very careful when we start to tinker with this most fundamental aspect of the human condition. And our role as parliamentarians, as decision makers, as legislators is vital in guaranteeing that everyone in our state has access to safe, affordable and accessible housing. While the right to appropriate housing is a fundamental need and a human right, the community expects that when we help those most vulnerable in our community, they will in turn feel obliged to behave in a way that does not impinge upon others in our community. This, of course, is the essence of being a good neighbour and making sure that your own enjoyment of life does not impact on your neighbours. About 8 months ago, a lady in Metford, let's call her Frida, told me a story of unneighbourly behaviour which she, as a social housing tenant herself, could not seem to resolve. Frida lived in a small area of social housing within the suburb. And every night she was greatly disturbed by the behaviour of a tenant and his partner. Frida told me that they were habitual drug users and that they were often loud and violent, and there were many fights between them. During the day, the man was constantly banging on a hammer, creating furniture for sale in breach of his lease arrangements. Frida had often called the police, however, without a warrant, they had not entered the property. Housing seemed unable to act without a police report. Another resident nearby suffered from a mental health condition and constantly swore and yelled at Frida whenever she went outside. Sometimes they made threats towards her. As an elderly and immobile lady, Frida felt unsafe just going to her letterbox to collect her mail, and she wasn't getting much sleep during the day. When I went to Frida's house to speak to her, she had convened a small meeting of some of her neighbours. They'd all observed the behaviours that Frida had reported, but they were reluctant to report them as they knew Frida was already reporting them, and like many people in social housing, they felt their right to be there was a privilege and didn't want to rock the boat. Many of them had been residents of the area for many years, and they now felt unsafe in their neighbourhood and were greatly disturbed by the actions of the couple in the house above Frida. There was a staff member from the Department of Housing at the meeting who advised that all residents should make complaints, that it was better if the complaints didn't come from one person all the time, and that they needed to all complain so that they could corroborate Frida's complaints. The staff member also indicated that their concerns about what would happen to the couple if they were evicted for breaching their lease arrangements. Where would they go? The housing staff member articulated quite well the delicate balance that exists between the rights of tenants and our obligation to ensure that the welfare of all of our community who require social housing. The Minister in his second reading speech indicated that such people would be moved into private housing, but surely an eviction from public housing would preclude them from such an arrangement, or at least make it very difficult. We need to have the option of a last resort for people before they are evicted. I note that a few weeks ago, when this bill was first introduced, it was Homelessness Week, and I want to know what we're doing with the people these people whose problems are not being addressed with all the cuts that have been made to community counselling, health and education and skills and TAFE. The basic fundamental need that we're talking about today is for more social housing, and throwing out the very small minority of people who put others in their community at risk will not address that problem. Throwing out the bad people won't build more social housing. I must reiterate that the people who use social housing are in the main upstanding members of our community. They've fallen on hard times but use the provision of social housing as a second chance and do their best to improve their economic situation. There's a trend within the media to report instances where people in public housing do not conform to communities' expectations of good neighbourly behaviour, to highlight situations where those who receive a benefit from the state have committed criminal or hurtful acts against others, and this is largely because these people are exceptions to the rules. And because when we see ourselves as behaving charitably or with good intentions, we want to see thanks. We want the beneficiary to be grateful, and if they don't behave with this attitude of gratefulness as a community, we feel somehow betrayed, as if they didn't appreciate our efforts to help them. Unfortunately, these reports tend to hold up those who fail to be neighbourly as indicative of the kind of people who live in social housing. They tend to be held up as an example rather than an exception. A few weeks ago, another family in my electorate came to my attention. This family had a very complex case history with mental illness, disability, poverty, family breakdown, all taking their toll. There had been a complete breakdown to the extent that the family's public housing property was significantly destroyed and the family was broken up. Worse, the young people in the family had been engaging in antisocial behaviour, and residents living around them were concerned about what would happen if they returned to the house, having lived through a long period where there had been destruction of property, threats of assault and theft that this bill is meant to address. I was contacted by a newspaper to discuss what action police, housing and community health were taking to deal with the family. I'd already followed up with these agencies and been told that the situation was being dealt with through government processes, and I'm proud to report that these agencies were confident the matter would be resolved. But the media interest got me thinking, would the media be interested in this story if they were renting privately? Why were they concerned about this one house when the majority of public housing tenants behave well? And I know that the majority of social housing tenants are model tenants intent on improving their lives and the opportunities for their families. Where do they want those who don't fit into this kind of social housing to go? And this is where I'm concerned about this bill. Yes, there are behaviours that are highly undesirable, and the ability to live in social housing is a great privilege to the vulnerable in our community. As a society, we reject the idea that people who are impoverished should live on the street. But in all this, we need to look at the factors that contribute to homelessness and the need for social housing. For the government to introduce this bill in the weeks after Homelessness Week seems somehow off to me. What will happen to the people who aren't meeting their obligations in social housing? Will they end up like those in Martin Place who rely on the food vans who are there every night to eat? I know our side of this place has proposed amendments to this legislation, and I urge the government to consider them with an open heart. This bill doesn't address any of the complexities and comorbidities that act and impact on many in social housing, including drug dependence, domestic violence, mental health, disability and family dysfunction. People do not arrive in social housing after asking for a bed for a night. They arrive after experiencing significant social disadvantage, sometimes across generations, and other massive negative upheaval in their lives. These people are some of the most vulnerable people in our community, and they are often the most ill-equipped to defend themselves against unfair evictions. The opposition's amendments are designed, amongst other measures, to protect innocent parties from termination orders, maintain the tribunal's discretion not to terminate in certain circumstances, ensure the tribunal has regard to tenants' remedies of previous breaches, accept out-of-time submissions in special circumstances, and ensure procedural fairness and natural justice in the hearing of neighbourhood impact statements. I believe that we must strive as a community to meet that most basic need of human needs for housing and shelter for all in our community. But I also believe that we cannot allow situations where people who will harm others to have the benefit of social housing without consequence. There must be some way to ensure that this is balanced and that communities are not harmed by the actions of a few. In doing this, in taking that drastic step of withdrawing our hand to help and instead shutting the door to social housing, we must ensure that those people have an option. I don't want to see more homeless people in our community. I want everyone in our community to live in dignity, safe from harm and free from harassment. I urge the government to consider the amendments of the members on this side of the House before they pass a bill which may not tread this fine line between the rights of all residents of social housing as softly as it should. Thank you.